We are really privileged to be joined by Uli. Uli is an international development expert, has worked and still works all over the world, and has spent a lot of time in South Africa. And knowing his work, he's been around and has a big influence on some of the development policies and our approach to local governance in South Africa in the early years of democratic local government. Uli, welcome to Local Government Matters. We are very privileged to have you. And so to kick us off, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you end up in this profession? And what do you think about it? And how did you end up in South Africa in this role? Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Ashraf. We go a long way in this common discernment and learning curves, and I'm very privileged to share a few of my insights. So lessons learned, experiences in this regard. Local governance is very close to my heart. Yeah, how did I get to South Africa? That's a very good question. Finally, turning 60, it appeared that due to my father's history of migration, forced migration, issues of racism in the very early stages of my life mattered to me. I was a Boy Scout, I traveled, and it was clear he was forcibly removed from the former East by the Russian army in the Second World War. And when my mother asked me that question before she passed away, I came to that conclusion. It's due to his history and how it impacted on my upbringing that South Africa mattered from the very early days. Then I studied theology, and I studied Kairos theology, the Kairos document in the 80s developed by outstanding theologians in Soweto. And I then became, I don't think accidentally, the vice president of the anti-apartheid movement in Germany, boycotting the travel to South Africa in the 80s due to the state of emergency. And then deciding in 90 that we have to go. And we were actually in the plane when in Nairobi, because in those days you had to almost circumvent the whole Africa to come to South Africa due to apartheid and the boycott. And then in the plane, the pilot said, and de Klerk announced that Mandela will be released on 10th of February. And we were like toying in the plane. Like really, we will be part of history, and we were part of history. And that really impacted on my life in the next 4 years, in the years of transition, 90 to 94. I lived in South Africa. I was part of, in the very, very back end, Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a theologian, commissioned by the World Council of Churches, supporting the SACC and all these people that were then so much engaged in the transition. In a nutshell, and since then, I do feel that I'm very close to the country. I learned so much in this transition. I learned so much. This was my concrete training camp, I usually call it, 90 to 94, the years of transition, to understand how difficult real societal change is, and that is nothing falls from heaven. It needs to be fought for. And all that brought me to the point that I want to give a bit back. And since then, I come regularly all the 2 to 3 years. I have my assignments. I worked for the German Development Corporation, supporting actually a bit Michael Sutcliffe, other colleagues. Yourself, you were on the demarcation board, like in the back end to do a bit of municipal legislation and all that. In a nutshell.
Okay. So you certainly have played a significant role in our local government architecture. What role did GIZ, the German International Development Agency, what role did GIZ and other international development actors play in the early years of democratic local government in South Africa? In that respect, if I may just add a bit, Uli, maybe more specifically, how much of South Africa's local government architecture was externally influenced?
If you asked me on 100%, I would say 50-50. I think I discovered and learned a lot from the self-esteem, from the clarity, from the young generation coming out of prison, from UDF, from ever, the ones who have struggled inside the country. Then we had this other generation, the old generation out of prison around Mandela, and wanted to be now fully in place and fully empowered, and not empowered, but taking office and govern the country under the conditions of compromise, of World Bank, big influencing parties like the European Commission, like the German government, to say, we were always against apartheid, so now let's be part of the solution as well, which is half true. We all know German government supported apartheid for much too long. They did not really follow our campaigns on boycotting products from South Africa, from apartheid South Africa. So without going too much detail to this struggle and story, I would say the Ebert Foundation, I will never forget, like in the end of 92, first experts came along, GTZ in those years, saying, oh, in the, what was it called? Help me, in 92, the convention, when we met in Pretoria or somewhere
Codesa.
close.
Codesa.
Yeah, Codesa. And then drafting first constitution. And then everybody was so thrilled that this is the most revolutionary constitution because leaning into federalism, which makes a lot of sense in the situation. And then German experts came along and said, okay, let's write part of your constitution. I was from day one very reluctant to, because one of the learnings I had, and this is why I doubt that I had so much importance, honestly speaking, Ashraf, because I wanted to make a different point of view into this and say, I let the ones who have struggled the most really write it up and be in the lead, in the driver's seat, because this is what I learned at the townships. That people came to me, I will never forget one very small story. I went to Kailicha very first, and Sharif from Carrick, Kailicha Education Center. We came there in our first trip. Mandela was released for 14 days. He walked out of prison in Cape Town. And Sharif invited us, and then we were all celebrating, for sure. And then Sharif put me aside and said, Uli, listen, Kai, it's nice that you want to invite us for dinner. This is not how we work. We will invite you for dinner, and then dinner for us means celebration. We go together, buying the grocery, working, we cook together, and then we celebrate. And we, at the apartheid activists, we were thinking we do something very good to the black man now, finally. Very good intentions, which happens all the time in development cooperation. Very good intentions. And then we do not understand the structural injustices, the structural racism that is there if there are white men coming and telling somebody what to do and to think and to do.
Okay. So do you think, in fact, just before I ask my question, you mentioned white people coming to do development work. There's a fantastic poem from the 1970s or 80s or something like it. I came across it as a student in 1980, the mid-1980s. It's called The Development Set. And it really is a parody on international development people who want to go and work in all these exotic countries to change the world and that kind of stuff. But essentially, they are just tourists in those countries, but they create the dependency, which is the problem. So my question then, Uli, do you think that South Africa established different relationships with agencies, international development agencies, because of our capacity locally, our strong academic influence, our research abilities, our really amazing leaders, political leaders, our determination to be relatively independent of the kind of influence that international agencies could bring? Do you think that is a factor that played a role?
In some instances and some policies and some strategies, I would fully agree. And especially if it comes to local governance and municipal legislation, the demarcation, the restructuring of but it was a century. It was a Hercules task to change this country from apartheid law, from 300 years of colonialism into a new nation. We all underestimated that. And the powers and the power interests. I still remember when we talked to Trevor Manuel and the guys in the unions then after Mandela was elected and inaugurated, we had a program on how to deal with the EU Fair Trade Agreement. And we went through COSATU meetings and whatever as advisors, always in the second line, saying, guys, the EU, what they are doing to do to you is like trading between elephant and mouse. Guys, there's this big thing that tells you what to export into the EU. And then the EU put up big lists where they are still under tax and tariffs. And it was so imbalanced that South Africa lost a lot in these very first years after, I was about to say unification, but that's German history, after the official ending of apartheid. And this was such an imbalance. And then finally and Trevor became Minister of Finance, and he said, we can't resist the EU. It's too powerful and we have to take agreements. And then under Thabo, a lot of things changed dramatically because of these power games. In the very first years after 94, I still remember that some of the South African government people, I still remember our friend from SACP, from Pietermaritzburg, who was Deputy Minister of Local Government. Name is gone now. Anyway, very committed guy. He said, Yunus Karim. Yeah, my Habibi. Yeah, Yunus Karim.
We'll be having him on a podcast discussion next week.
Wow, give him my best regards. I learned a lot from him. He told me, like already in the years of transition, he said, we will reject this World Bank offer because of 1, 2, 3, 4. They make us dependent on 1, 2, 3, 4. We had these kind of discussions, but and then let me go to one example that was in my mind for years, which made a big difference because South Africans themselves were in the leadership, not us as developmentalists, not us as agency representatives. You remember when you were in NMB city manager, we had this, was it in your time or before? We had this beautiful learning partnership on the World Cup. Ne?
Yeah, I was never a city manager, but yeah,
Okay.
I know what you're talking about. Yes,
But you were in Nelson Mandela Bay within some function.
that's correct. Yes, I was in the
And that-
Mandela Bay Development Agency. Yes.
Yes, exactly. So that, I think that was before. So we said we had this brilliant idea bringing the German host cities of the World Cup 10, then to the South African 14, and then to 18 in Brazil to build a partnership to how to run the tiger. That was the title. Because we all know that FIFA is one of the biggest, most corrupt organizations in the world. Imposing the city development plans, let alone SDIP, whatever you developed in good strategic and investment planning on municipal level. They said, you build this stadium here. And then we had, like, in the 9 host cities, I think 6 new stadiums were built by a German big company. And I said, please, we have to make a difference. Why don't we bring the institutions together, the municipal guys who will deal with FIFA, who will brief their mayors how to sign the agreements? And that made a big difference. It created a learning partnership, but the South Africans were in the driver's seat, bringing in experts who had experience how the FIFA is dealing with the city manager. And that made a big difference. And I'm very proud of this program because it shows that development cooperation can do something good as long as it's clear who is driving the process, the pace, the impact, and how you measure impact.
Okay. Yeah, that was before my time at the Mandela Bay Development Agency. Having said that, when you talk about development as alignment, or is it interference, are international agencies sufficiently sensitive to context, or are they really one size fits all? The reason I ask this question is that the language, no matter which country you go to, no matter which international urban forum you attend, the language generally seems to be the same. In fact, in 2020, I attended a course in Marseille hosted by the French Development Agency. And the presentations they made there, they had the same solutions for Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, the capital of Burkina Faso. They had the same solutions for public transport there as they had in the island of Mayotte, which is a tiny place in the Indian Ocean, which France controls. And so I was just wondering, is there sufficient sensitivity to context by international development agencies?
Definitely not. Definitely not. And I would even go as far as saying that that's one of the reasons why these top-down development approaches are also really vastly questioned. I mean, we all complain about the closure of the USAID. I tell you my honest perception, 50% of what USAID did with ignoring local content, with ignoring the local partners, with putting money top down and their policies. Development cooperation, let's face it, has never been without interest. It's not an altruistic approach in really helping. Unfortunately, it was perceived throughout the years, especially if it's governmental driven. There's no government which doesn't have an interest if it puts money into a program in a foreign country. And this, I learned that in my very first and 3 years in the struggle, in the societal change. But realizing it in cooperation. Up until now, I challenged in 20 years of my time in GIZ, I challenged each and every desk officer in BMZ, in the respective ministries, and said, okay, government negotiations are fine. You're talking to governments, but what about civil society? If you support governance and government, why are you not consulting with civil society at least before you go to the government negotiations? And it starts from that level. It starts top down. If you don't listen to your constituency and to your communities, to whom do I say that? You will fail. And then you develop nice indicators, and then you come to those solutions that you think their strategic development and investment planning is the one fits for all in each and every country. And you celebrate it because also big organizations tend to be very self-reliant. and not building
So,
this kind of localization.
yeah, it's very interesting you mentioned that it's about self-interest. The idea of international development aid really started with the independence movement after the Second World War.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't know if India was the first
Yeah.
post-war country to get independence, but I do recall, I wasn't around then, but I do recall reading that firstly, India was one of the wealthiest places in the world. It wasn't a
Yeah.
country, it was a region, one of the wealthiest regions in the world before colonialism. And then when the British left, in inverted commas, in 1947, it was one of the poorest. And in that context, and to maintain their control, the British decided that they were consciously going to provide development aid to India and newly independent countries and things. And that's how the Commonwealth started.
Exactly.
Do you think that this top-down and managing tensions and things like that, do you think there are examples of how those tensions between top-down and what the country wants for itself versus what the donor country's objectives are? Are there ways in which those tensions between accountability to the funders and the empowerment of recipients, how do you think that has been dealt with? Has it been dealt with? Is it still an issue? Have we moved a long way from where we started in the 1940s? Where do you think this issue of the tension between development agency objectives and country objectives are, and how do they get resolved?
Yeah, that's exactly my point. What are the country objectives? That's exactly the challenge. If we go around the world, I listened to the opposition leader from Ecuador the other day. He spoke to our municipal banking system guys or the CEOs, and he said nowadays, 35 years after the Cold War, blah, 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 we are living in times where we have 40 countries under oligarchic leadership. And he for sure included Trump and Putin and Erdogan and Modi in India. And then he said, if I predict and see the signs of the time, then in about 10 years, this will go up to 70% of countries under oligarchy. And we all looked at each other and said, my goodness. So my question to you is, in shrinking spaces for civil society, for even freedom of speech, what is the country's will? And who is consulting with whom? Who is at the table when those big cooperation agreements are signed? It's politicians, it's appointed oligarchs, whatever, who signed these agreements. I give you another very small example. When I was in the Middle East, there was something what we call the Arab Spring. You remember that time in Northern Africa. I was attending the government negotiations in Egypt. And a young, high-profile guy, a woman actually, came to represent the German government vis-a-vis the newly Sisi's guys after Mubarak was out. And then this guy said, yeah, I think the Arab Spring gave us so many insights, and we do understand that you need governance now in Egypt, no? So can we focus on the governance sector? And these guys on the other side, freshly appointed ministers, said, what the, excuse my language, ne? What the F are you telling me? After 30 years of your support for Mubarak, you come again and tell us we need governance? I enjoyed that government negotiation so much. And this is the point. Are we realizing, are we learning out of those lessons? No, unfortunately not. We remain in the same structures. And then we wonder why in our own societies, where we still have, lucky we are, freedom of speech, people are questioning development cooperation. I've never seen times after 60 years, 65 years of existence of our structures, parastatal structures, DIZ, BMZ, you name it, is such a big gap in trusting development cooperation that it really achieves something. It's questioned broadly in our own society. And I tell my decision makers in the ministry, guys, you are part of it. You caused part of the problem and the how do you say, the Glaubwürdigkeitslücke in German. There's a credibility lack. The narrative's changed. And now talking about decolonization and localization, what the ones who are pushing our agenda are doing, it will not be enough. We have to practice localization in a very different manner. But again, nothing new. We are saying that since 35 years, but we are only a few, let's face it. But local government, to come back to your question, can be still, and in my conviction, is still the training camp. Local government matters so much because what happens and functions, this is why we call it localization. If we find solutions on the local level, we have to mirror it globally and then going back to from global experience down to local again.
Okay, that's a good point. So, given what you just mentioned, and given the fact that we now explained the challenges and the problems associated with the way in which development aid functions and the impact it has. In fact, just as an example, when Trump and Elon dealt with the USAID in the way in which they did, one of the concerns raised was that they were funding parallel structures in certain countries, which served to undermine those countries. I think India, there was a media agency in India.
Yeah.
In Africa, there were some other kinds of organizations. This trend of donors funding parallel structures instead of strengthening state institutions, how do we deal with that? And have you been able to do that? Can you share a project or areas where you've worked where you were able to say, look, this is not the way we should be doing things. This is what we should be doing with the donor money in terms of building democracy and strengthening state institutions. Have you got examples of the kind of work that you've done in that respect?
Yeah, very much. And I must admit, compared the German Development Corporation with USAID, in all the countries I was assigned in, let it be West Africa, Middle East, I'm working in Pakistan now. Honestly speaking, 50-60% of the US funding always went back into their own pockets. They imposed all that you have in purchasing things. You have to purchase Jeep, General Motors. Let's face it, I've seen that so many times. And unfortunately, also like in some of the UN structures, they then, because of New York-based high influence of Washington, followed them. But I don't want to just do a blame and shame game here. The good thing with the German Development Corporation may be at least be that the local project manager has a decentralized, quite a big power on the budget and how he or she are implementing the program. So it was due to that I felt always like I can shape something differently. But then again, plays back to me, is it depends on the person. Are you learning the local language? Are you going really along? Are you not just there for 3 years in and out? Are you committing to say, I'm a learner here? And this was not trained in the preparation workshops and seminars. It was something that I brought from my NGO time. And they gave me space. They let me do. As long as you grow and implement your programs and achieve your indicators, everybody will say, okay, he's a nice guy. So what do I want to say? There is space to do things differently, but structurally, it's still a top-down system, let's face it. And that means it is a replication in another nice dress of colonial structures and decision-making. I do have these samples, like our beautiful city-to-city cooperation program, where we really made all ourselves the learners and really brought the experts into exchange and really abstained. We facilitated a program. And the city managers, the head of sports departments, the guys who did the work on the ground, they exchanged. And then they learned how to deal with the bloody FIFA guys to a certain extent and the governmental intention and whatever. And as better than me, out of this good example that I raised in our beginning of our podcast, I think Michael once told me, or Johan, I don't remember even, or Shanaz or somebody of our friends told me that only half of the municipalities went out of the FIFA World Cup not fully indebted.
Yeah, no, that's just.
And how do we learn out of these experiences?
So, I want to touch on that towards the end, but I'm going to ask you 3 very specific questions, Uli. The first one is, have you seen a municipality stand up to a donor and grow stronger as a result?
Yes. Yes.
Give us an example.
Yeah, if I look into when he's now minister, I think in Mpumalanga. When he was the mayor of Johannesburg, we did a lot of amazing changes and he stood up in front of donors. He was a very calm person. He was smart enough to, in some of those negotiations, lean back and say, thank you. I listened to all of you. Come back in 1 week, then we talk. And then he took decisions which were not always donor aligned and were very challenging, actually, also to GIZ, my colleagues there. Because why? Very simple thing, Ashraf, you will not believe it, but the city of Joburg paid the local staff of GIZ much better than GIZ paid them. It's not the only factor, but it is something so important. If we continue to go to these countries and pay our seconded staff like what ministers receive in our respective partner countries, for sure it will be a messed up situation. And South Africa, in that case, and Parks made a big difference in that. He got one of the best colleagues.
Yeah. So you're saying that leadership plays a very important role.
Absolutely.
And you need to be a strong leader. And in the case of Parks, you don't need to be a loud leader. You can be soft-spoken.
Yeah.
Make a strong impact.
And guide your guys, guide your own leadership in a way that they really feel, I do have the back of my mayor. I can lean out. I can tell the GIZ colleagues, listen, guys, this is the limit. We define what is the best envisaged outcome, not you. You can't come,
So you need to set
fund our workshop, and then we go ahead.
Yeah. So you need to set the tone from the top, essentially.
Absolutely.
My next question is an example of a global framework like the Sustainable Development Goals? I can't remember what the latest is. Oh, there's the climate goals, the Paris climate goals.
Yeah.
Do you think that there are examples of those being misunderstood or misapplied? Or perhaps I should ask the question differently. Are these goals applicable? Can you use them as a framework to make a difference in one's own development in your country or municipality? Or are they too generic? In other words, how relevant are these? Because all the agencies, all the international development agencies take their cue from what the global agenda is. So the UN has said it's the NDGs. Before that, it was the Millennium Development Goals, and all the agencies forefronted that in the conditions. Like now, it's climate infrastructure, climate change, and things like that. Do you think it's possible?
It's funny that you're asking it today, because we are just about to start the SP62, the Climate Convention negotiations here in Bonn. You know that we are hosting the UNFCCC Secretariat in Bonn since the beginning, since 92 already. And I'm attending whenever I can. Honestly, I'm very frustrated about these processes due to the fact that we do see even since the 90s, a deterioration of multilateralism. And I learned a hard lesson working with different UN structures in the last, let me say, 25 years, 30 years. A hard lesson in the sense of a very good friend of mine sitting in UNFPA leadership. She always told me, Uli, the UN is only the mirror of the biggest countries and what they put on the table. And the Security Council is the one and only. And all the other structures are not actually instruments of development with teeth. And I learned a hard lesson, and multilateralism is on a large scale, not just deteriorating, it lost credibility. Because let's face it, if it comes to Palestine, if it comes to Ukraine, if it comes to these issues, the global West, what we call the global democratized blah, blah, blah West, totally double standards, totally failed to at least, who are we in Germany to claim moral ground in terms of human rights when we have these double standards in the judgment of wars and crises and apartheid?
Okay.
And that's very political, I know, but I think it's important to realize
but that does bring me to almost the last question, and it goes back to the points that you had raised. How is international development shifting? If you look at the issues you raised earlier on about the oligarchs, if you look at the realignment of politics in the USA and in Europe, and you look at the climate emergency, the poly crisis, how is international development shifting in that context? And can South-South partnerships replace or complement traditional donors? In other words, we can see now that donor money from the global north is beginning to dry up, or has already dried up.
Yeah.
We're seeing a change in the world with BRICS and the realignment of South relationships and North-South relationships. Do you think that relying on each other is perhaps something that's on the cards? In other words, what opportunities are opening up for the global South and local government in the global South in the changing world? And how would international development fit into that changing world?
In worst case scenario, in 5 years, we will not even talk about international development cooperation anymore. In worst case scenario, in good case scenario, if the global South defines what is next under these buzzwords of localization. I was just coming back from training with Pakistani consultants in Pakistan, in Islamabad, after traveling the country after the big flood in 22. Pakistan is one of those tipping point countries. The reality in our global world is now that the ones who the least responsible for the global crises are suffering most of the global crises. If it comes to forced migration, to war, to extremism, to climate crisis, people in Pakistan, 1/5 of the country was flooded for more than 6 months. We don't have an estimate of that. And that's in the Indus Valley. So these parts were are destroyed. There's no agriculture for the next 20 years because of the soil is intoxicated. So what I want to say, either we do realize, but then in the same time in Pakistan, I said it very clearly. There were some of these big Pakistani guys which have their second house in London, built all their kids in the UK. The UK has the biggest migration. And I said, guys, you asked me what's the future of development cooperation. Where is your money? Where do you put your money? And then they looked at me and said, what the heck? What is he saying? So either we come to put our money where our mouth is, and then development cooperation will be defined by the ones who want development and want the process, but then they put the money where their mouth is. And then they might not depend anymore on World Bank, on GIZ. So this is what the real localization means as a change. And I'm pushing this agenda, for God's sake, it's needed. And then it means that we will not, and we have to stop this 100% funding programs, which are interest-led. As I said, there's no government which gives taxpayer money interest-less into a program.
So as we move towards the end of the conversation, Uli, you are the head of a faith-based development consultancy, Piron, Piron. And
it's a small house close to Stellenbosch, because my companion and myself, we both love the Cape region. He studied there, and then we took that as a name.
Okay. That's interesting. So your German company has a South African name of South African origin. Okay.
Intentionally.
But now, given your faith and given your concerns almost as a lefty in terms of the appreciation of the challenges to development and development aid and development support, what does an ethical, effective development agency look like from 2025 onwards? And what should municipalities ask for or push back against in these global partnerships? And if you can conclude with what gives you hope that local government can lead rather than follow in the global development narratives?
What really gives me hope is like the networks we have built in the last 35 years. People of commitment, people of clear ethical politics, commitments, convictions. I have these long-lasting relationships where I feel so home, just of the fact that I see we have not ethically or from our belief systems, we have not changed. We still believe in substantial transformation. We can still facilitate a lot of these things. And I'm not saying still, I do have the hope, even if a lot of my younger friends in my consultancy always ask me, what gives you hope? Same question that you're asking. And I say, you have to have a bit of a Sisyphus mentality. You pull the ball up the mountain, it will go down again. But the ones you meet on the way are the most important, because that makes a change and that gives hope, because they pick up on your persistence, on your resilience, on your commitment. And I've seen so many people who came back after years and years and said, Uli, what you told me 25 years ago. And that's for me Christmas. This is for me like when things come together and I feel, it makes sense, because we can still change it. We can still transform.
So you're saying then that good leadership, strong leadership, ethical leadership, and relentless leadership.
Yeah. Don't give too much space to the ones who want to distract you.
Yeah, and don't be distracted. Stick to the mission. Uli, thank you so much. This was a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed it. And good luck with all the work that you do. I know you do fantastic work in different parts of the world, particularly in countries that are coming out of conflict or are still involved in conflict, immersed in conflict. All strengths to you, and thank you very much for your participation.